This is a pest management workshop, and we'll get into, I hear a lot of people have a problem with cucumber beetles. I only heard one person mention weeds, so thank you. That means I guess nobody else has problems with weeds. Or Lee, talks eloquently about some of the benefits that things that we call weeds might provide to a system. But I think, from my experience, I did work on organic farms for quite a few years before I started getting into research. And one of the reasons I got into weed science was because I spent a lot of time on my hands and knees trying to pull weeds out of carrots. And I saw a lot of squash fields get overwhelmed with weeds. And so, there's a balance there. If you know what you're doing, you might be able to let weeds do some work for you. But more often than not, on most farms that I see, weeds can become a big problem. And they're not really specific to cucurbits, so they're more generalists. Cucumber beetles, yes, they're going to attack cucurbits. Weeds are everywhere, and so discussing this in the context of cucurbits is a little bit challenging. So I thought I'd just give you a little bit of structured slides, and then as questions come up, you guys can stop me and ask whatever you want. This is kind of what I planned, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it comes up, what is a weed, a little bit of why we care about weeds, and then try to focus most of my comments on this part, which ties in, I think, again to what Lee and Jacob are talking about is, what kinds of things can you do on your farm to prevent weeds from becoming a big problem in the first place. Many of us are past that stage, so we'll also want to think about, okay, we did as much as we can with prevention. What are some things that we need to do in the crop itself if some of those weeds are still there? And I think we know, most of you who've been farming for a while, weeds are often still there. And then if we have time, I'll go into some more cucurbit examples, but if you guys want to ask questions as I go, again, that's fine. So my own background, most of the work that I'm currently doing, and it's tied into this grant, is really thinking about cover crops and how cover crops can be used for lots of purposes, managing soils, maintaining soil moisture, but also some of their effects, potential beneficial effects on weed management. So that'll be a little bit more of my emphasis. And then we've been doing a lot of work recently with mechanical weed management, different types of cultivators. And again, this is something that's built into our grant. And I just want to give you a little flavor of some of the different cultivation equipment that we're testing and some of the ideas there. So first of all, just quickly, what is a weed? Just a couple slides here to get you thinking a bit more about this. I had an opportunity to spend a year in Nepal a couple years ago on my sabbatical leave, and this is my son going to school. And this is a Nepali who has been walking through the neighborhood and cutting all these plants that you might think of as weeds in the US, but she's bringing these to feed her livestock. So it's difficult to define a weed based on the species, and obviously the context is really important. Here's a picture from northern India of a woman who's walking through a wheat field, and she's harvesting this plant, which Lee has held up. I've got my show and tell here. So this is Chenopodium album, which is lamb's quarters, of course, and most of us growing vegetables maybe curse at it, but there is, it's essentially very similar to wild spinach, and parts of the world they eat it, and it's a valuable source of nutrition. Here's a picture of, again, lamb's quarters at the marketplace. People go through their wheat fields. It's a weed in their wheat, but they pull it out, bring it to market, and sell it. And then if you look at a lot of the kind of indigenous vegetable crops in the world, a lot of these are what we would consider weed species. So that's just a couple examples, again, from Nepal of some of the species that they're either pulling from their fields to eat or they're intentionally growing. So you think about non-crop plants that are growing in your fields, and we know weeds are a problem, but what about this situation? This was one of my first attempts to do reduced tillage cabbage, and what you see here is hairy vetch. We didn't let it get to full flower, and it came back to haunt us. So here's an example of a plant that was intentionally put into the field to try to give us some benefits, and it ended up being a weed. So again, you can't define a weed by what species it is. You have to think about cabbage finish, but it was pretty reduced, and you can maybe see over here we had a conventional till control that was probably double the yield. So it wasn't a good situation. We've gotten better at this, but it's a good example of things that can go wrong. I think this is a situation that I've seen quite a bit on organic farms, and this is actually a conventional farm. And if you look really carefully, you might see the edges of a butternut squash in there. But it's mostly this species, pigweed. And you can say lots of things about you can eat the leaves and you can collect the seeds. It's, you know, the grain of the Aztecs and so forth. But or you could not eat squash. Right? So if you have a really good market for pigweed, you're in good shape here. But for most of us, this is not what we want to see. So, you know, there, as I've said and as Lee has said, there are situations where those weeds are, you know, they're successional, they're filling in gaps, they're preventing soil erosion, all those potentially good things. But if you don't know what you're doing and you want to make a living and you want to feed your family, you've got to do something to avoid this situation. So I won't harp on this too much. Lots of potential negative effects, and yield loss is the most obvious. So if you have that pigweed growing, you're not going to harvest your crop potentially. Other things that you may not think about quite as much and maybe don't apply too well on a small scale, but we see this a lot on a large scale. Here's two guys. This is a pepper harvest in Saginaw. These two guys all day long are reaching their hands down into the harvester, pulling weeds out of there so the thing doesn't jam up. And of course, they're probably also getting a yield, and yeah, not what you really want to be doing. Other things that you might not think about too much, and this could go either way. You can have weeds that might attract beneficials, but you can also have weeds that perhaps exacerbate pest issues. Anybody recognize what's happening to this pepper? You'll learn a lot more about this afternoon. It's a disease that also affects cucurbit crops. Anybody know what that might be? Bacterial, that's a good guess. You might have something that looks like that. Bacterial wilt, I don't think really affects peppers. This is actually Phytophthora capsicii, major disease problem in a lot of cucurbit crops. And it turns out that there's some alternative hosts that can, you know, act as biobridges. So something like purslane is an alternative host for Phytophthora. How about this one? Anybody who grows a diverse vegetable farm recognize what that is? Colorado potato beetle. So this affects a lot of solanaceous crops. And we often see, you know, you try to rotate your potatoes, but maybe there's some horse nettle that comes up, or some eastern black nightshade, or a weed that's in the Solanaceae family, and you start seeing these guys pop up there. And so it, again, can be a biological bridge to disrupt your rotation, so you'll still have that pest, even if you were pretty good about rotating away from potatoes. Okay, and then maybe last example of non-yield loss related issues for weeds is contaminants. This was when I was a postdoc working in New York. A baby food company sent me this sample from beans that they were going to process for baby food, and it had all these contaminants in here. And so I spent some time pulling these apart and trying to figure out what they were. This here is a morning glory seed, which has, you know, LSD. It's got the same active ingredient, so not something you really want to chop up and put into your baby food. And then actually here in Michigan, I got a sample, I forget which, but again, a processor, and it had this in it. That took me a while to figure out, and then I finally realized that's velvet leaf. So it's actually a very common weed. If you pull apart the head of the velvet leaf, you get these little spiky, so inside of there are the seeds. I think I'll skip quickly through this. You know, impacts of weeds, I think I've emphasized yield loss. If you look at weeds worldwide, about 60% of all the pesticides that are applied by active ingredient are for killing weeds. So you can imagine as an organic farmer, if you've removed that tool, that's one of the reasons we have weed problems on organics. Yeah, so if you're really trying to have a major impact on the environment, reducing that 60% of active ingredients through organic production is one obvious way to do it. But despite all that, worldwide yield losses to weeds, you know, up to 25%. And we've probably all seen situations where it was closer to 100%. And then worldwide, again, thinking about this is a statistic that I think is interesting and gets you thinking about importance of weeds in the world. So more human labor is expended on weeding than any other single human activity. This was a little bit dated. I'm not sure it's still true, but it's if you spent any time, what's that? Likely, yeah. You think about your own labor and how that balances out. But in places like West Africa, where this guy's out there at 4 o'clock in the morning, all day long, removing weeds with this hoe in his millet field. Similar pictures in other places of the world. And then in the West, we're not immune from this. This is a picture from an organic carrot field in Europe. And they got a slightly more comfortable way of doing this. But it doesn't look to me like a whole lot of fun. You can find YouTube videos of these contraptions. And each person has a little knife. And they're removing weeds as they go through the carrots. So some of these vegetables, carrots in particular, are very slow growing. If you're trying to do it organically, you can end up spending a lot of time and energy on weeding. All that by introduction. That was probably a little bit too much, but hopefully you guys appreciate some of the issues that can happen with weeds and some of their costs, both in terms of yield loss and other things. And so now I want to give a few examples of preventive approaches. So it's kind of like taking care of ourselves. If you can prevent disease, you're a lot better off than trying to take medicine after the fact. And so I think this is a principle that's going to be true of any pest, is what are some approaches that we can use to avoid the problem in the first place. And thinking about this, and again, you'll see this, I'm sure, in the insect and disease sections, it's important to think about life cycles of pests and where they might be most vulnerable to suppression. And so for weeds, you have this typical picture where a weed has germinated, and if you don't do a good job controlling it, here it is in your field, and ultimately it might start producing seeds. And those seeds, of course, will fall into your field and get incorporated either by tillage or just natural processes into what we like to refer to as the weed seed bank. So you're depositing some things into your soil. Those seeds are sticking around for a long time in the soil. And then in future years, they're germinating and potentially causing problems again. So in terms of prevention, most of our weed management is really focused on this stage. We got the weed in our field. What do we do about it? We go out and hoe. We go out and spray. We go out and cultivate. But there are some things that we might be able to do focusing on the weed seed bank to kind of avoid buildup of so many weeds that we're overwhelmed when the crop actually comes. So a couple general strategies that come from this. One is minimizing deposits, so preventing seed production. That's kind of obvious. And then trying to figure out how can we draw down this seed bank, maximizing withdrawals. We want to have as few seeds in our soil as possible prior to the crop being planted. This is a picture from, again, carrots. I keep picking on carrots, but I don't think you guys have too much of this weed. This is called Galansoga ciliata. If you start seeing, does anybody have this?
Can you say it again?
Galansoga.
Oh, great.
Some people call it gallant soldier, which is convenient for remembering the genus. We had one person raise their hand. Yeah, if you see this one, kill it before it gets to this stage, because each of these, about 40 days, it produces viable seeds. Some people call it quickweed.
So fast.
So here's a species that very quickly germinates, and here's a field of it from New York State. I actually tried to estimate how much seed was being produced. I had approximately 1 million seeds per meter squared being produced by this thing if you don't control it. So I guess it's kind of obvious, but again, avoiding seed production is a really big deal. So people make a big deal about having seeds that live forever in the soil, and I think weed scientists to some extent have done a disservice by promoting that idea. In fact, a lot of species don't live that long in the soil. So some people say, well, they're going to live forever, so why should I even worry about it? I'm just going to let nature take its course, and if a few go to seed, it's not that big a deal. In fact, so some species, like that common lambsquarters, this is a study that shows how long those seeds live in the soil. So this is the years required for half of those seeds to disappear. And so for common lamb's quarters, you got 1 million seeds per meter squared. You wait 12 years, you still have 500,000 seeds per meter squared. So you're kind of screwed, right? But for some species, and particularly a lot of grasses, that half-life is much shorter. So something like crabgrass, 1.5 years, and this could be even cut down depending on your soil conditions and your management. So a species like large crabgrass, if you really avoid seed production, you can get close to getting rid of it pretty quickly. This is kind of the concept. These triangles are supposed to represent weed seeds in the soil, so getting back to the weed seed bank. And this is supposed to represent the crop. And so the idea with a stale seed bed is one approach here is you prepare your bed in advance, and then you either just let the weed seeds germinate or you do something to stimulate them to germinate. So some growers will irrigate, some might put something over it to stimulate germination. But generally speaking, you're trying to get these seeds in the surface layer to germinate so that you can then kill them before you've even planted your crop. And the idea is, in this idealized world, there's no weed seeds in there after you've done this. And so then the crop germinates and it's happy. Of course, this is highly idealized. They've got one kind of weed here. You mentioned some other ones. So a more realistic picture would have about 20 different shapes here with different dormancy characteristics. You're always going to have some that come later. So avoiding seed rain, seed production is critical. Another one people don't think that much about is avoiding having seeds in your cover crop. I bought this rye seed from a co-op in Michigan. I won't say who they were. And I said, there seems to be little black seeds in there. I said, that's just vetch. And I said, well, it'd be good to know if it was vetch, because vetch could be a problem. So I took it back to the lab and I sieved it, and this is what I got from that much rye. And when you zoom in, you see that, and you zoom in some more. It's not vetch. This is a Polygonaceae lady's thumb, which can be a very serious problem. So here, if you didn't have that on your farm, you went to that co-op, you bought your cover crop seed, you planted it, now you've got this in your field, spread perfectly evenly throughout your field, right? And this one is corn cockle. It's a beautiful purple flower that, in fact, I don't think it's that big of a problem in vegetables, and it may have some nice beneficial effects. It's one of the wildflowers that's planted in mixes in Switzerland to attract beneficials. So some of these things might be fine. Some of them, maybe not so much. But knowing what you're doing is going to be important. So you can think about cover crops. The other big one is manures. I've seen lots of farms where they didn't have a big weed problem, and then they applied manure, and then the next year, sure enough, something came up. Velvet leaf is one. Johnston grass, okay, maybe. Yeah, some of these weed seeds, like velvet leaf, if a cow ingests it, it actually it breaks dormancy, and it survives, and then it's in the manure, and then you put the manure in the field, and you've got velvet leaf all of a sudden. So another thing to be careful when you're planting your cover crops or you're putting manure on a field, to be sure you know if there's any weed problems there. Quickly on the crop rotation, I think Lee said this pretty well. A lot of weed management and a lot of pest management can be improved just by having diverse rotations. I'll get to the chickweed. But this is just one study that demonstrated this, and I don't put too much data up here, but this I thought was kind of interesting. Here's a continuous wheat production and the buildup of a weed species where they just had continuous wheat. You can see very quickly downy brome, which is very well adapted to the wheat life cycle, became a major problem. When they rotated rapeseed, canola, into this wheat rotation, they essentially eliminated this downy brome problem. So by having diversity in your rotation, to some extent, you eliminate certain weeds from building up, because weeds tend to be very well adapted to a particular crop. So if you disrupt their life cycle, they can't produce seeds for a year. A grass that's short-lived, you may not have a problem. I said I do a lot of work on cover crops, and I know there's some interest here in cover cropping. So let me say a few things about cover crops. And I should preface this by saying there's lots of reasons to grow cover crops well beyond weed management. We don't want to get so narrow that we're just thinking, oh, what am I do for my weeds? you need to think about the net effect on your entire farm and your cropping system that these cover crops might have. But from the weed perspective, I think there's a couple ways in which cover crops can be very helpful. The most obvious is as smother crops. So if you've got a vigorous cover crop, that's supposed to be this grass here, and this is supposed to be a pigweed or something. If you've got a vigorous cover crop, you can perhaps, during fallow periods, prevent that pigweed from producing seeds. And you may also, this is where the chickweed fits in, prevent winter annual establishment. So if you've got a vigorous cover crop growing in the fall, that chickweed's never going to get going. And I'll show you a picture of that. So that's kind of the smother crop idea. Then we've also touched on this. How can you, and I think Jacob talked about this, growing a cover crop like rye that survives over the winter and then roller crimping or mowing it, you're getting a number of benefits from that in terms of moisture retention, but you're also, if you have enough of it, preventing emergence of weeds. And there have been studies that also show sometimes you get increased activity of things that are beneficial, including beetles that eat weed seeds. Zofia and I spent a couple years studying this, and we actually found the opposite, that there were more beetles where we tilled. So this is kind of what the books say and what you might romanticize as what might happen, but in reality it doesn't always work that way. And part of that is we were kind of working in a disturbed system where the beetles were very well adapted to tillage. But anyway, depending on your system and how long you've been working on it, you might start to get buildup of beneficials that are eating weed seeds or eating something else that's valuable. And then the third kind of impact that cover crops can have on weeds, and I'm not going to talk too much about this, but you guys have heard of allelochemicals. These are essentially natural herbicides. And I like to give the example of sorghum sudan grass. When you grow sorghum sudan grass and you mow it and incorporate it into the soil, it actually has a compound called sorgoleone, which binds onto the photosynthetic pathway of plants in almost exactly the same way as atrazine. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know, but that's a allelochemical, a natural herbicide. If you think of cucurbits over here, and we're trying to think of prevention, so we're trying to think of things you can do before you plant your cucurbits to avoid weed problems. There's lots of things you can do. One of them, as I said, if you happen to have an early harvested crop, and so we've got carrot growers who are growing wheat. The wheat comes out in July. There's a chance there to plant something. We've got vegetable growers growing garlic. Garlic comes out in July. Maybe you put another crop in, or maybe you decide I'm going to do a cover crop. And that cover crop could have many benefits. It might attract beneficials. It might protect your soil and so forth. But thinking about the next year, if you have a winter-killed cover crop, kind of like Jacob was saying, he's moving towards a lot of these winter-killed cover crops. I put here oats and mustard, but peas and other things might fit there. What might that do for you in terms of chickweed? So we've done a lot of trials with this. This is a drone photo of one of our trials where we had oilseed radish. This was a peas had come out, and we planted oilseed radish. We planted oats and cowpeas. We planted dwarf Essex rape. Here's our control. We planted oats, some other kinds of cowpeas, and then we had an oat oilseed radish mix. And so that was planted in August. We did that at 4 different farms. Here's a picture from one farm of what the oats oilseed radish mix looked like in October. That's a lot of biomass. Should have had my son standing here for scale, but a lot of biomass. And I really like this mixture, and I'll show you one of the reasons why I like it. So that's October. Now fast forward to last spring. Here's what that plot looked like. So it winter killed. We didn't mow it or anything. Broke down. And then this is the grower is a strip till farmer. He strip tilled into this. And you can see not a single weed in there. Here is where we had no cover crop, and that there is the chickweed. That's the chickweed you're talking about, among other things. But this would be mostly winter annuals, so chickweed, shepherd's purse, a lot of mustard family. Some perennials can also start to take hold in that niche. Things like mare's tail.
stuff we see in neglected fall fields.
Yeah, so a lot of things can establish, and they're sort of winter annuals, but they can also shed seed, and they can behave also like summer annuals. They're happy to germinate any time that there's an opening. And so this grower had to disc this entire field twice to kill all the chickweed. This is after he disked it. If he had had this, he would have perhaps avoided any disking, still strip tilling, and this is a very nice seed bed to plant things into. This is kind of the data that corresponds to that. And so here's the cover crop, no cover crop, percent winter annual ground cover, 55. And then if with these different radishes, we were able to knock that down to almost nothing. The other thing you'll see here, these are summer annuals. So this is the pigweeds and the lamb's quarters. And this was a bit of a surprise to me, but here's where we had no cover crop. And this is in the next year's crop. This is how many of those weeds came up. Where we had our winter cover crops, we knocked that down substantially. This is still a lot of weeds. You'd still need to do something about it, but it's a lot fewer than you would have otherwise. I think the main reason why is that where we didn't have the cover crops, lamb's quarters went to seed, pigweed went to seed. So we had a lot of seeds shed on the soil surface. So this shows you how crop density, and I think this is important when thinking about cover crops especially, the more dense your crop or your cover crop is, the less of a weed problem you have. So this is weed biomass. If you're looking to plant a cover crop, for example, and I gave the example of sorghum sudan grass, if you look in managing cover crops profitably, I don't know what seed rate they give, but I think it's like 20 or 25 pounds. I've grown sorghum sudan grass at 25 pounds, and I've grown it at 75 pounds. And if you do it at 25 pounds, you look in there towards the end of the summer, there's little pigweeds in there. Don't look like much, but they've got little seed heads. And you take and you look at the seed heads, and there's thousands of seeds, even though you think, oh, I've got this great smother crop. I don't see any big weeds, but there's a little pigweed happily producing hundreds of thousands of seeds. But if you bump that rate up to 75 pounds, there's no pigweed. So that's what this is illustrating for something else. Bump your seed densities. If your goal is weed suppression, usually the higher the rate you sow, the more weed suppression. The other part of this is a little more esoteric, but it has to do with how those plants are arranged in the field. If you have wide rows, the pigweed's going to happily come up through at a distance from it. If you have a more square configuration, so you narrow your rows and you spread the plants out in the row, that'd be more square planting pattern, the pigweed that's coming up here is going to get suppressed. And so this example shows you that if you have a row structure like I described, you got a lot of weeds, where if you go down to a more square, uniform configuration, same seeding density, you can suppress your weeds. So that's a principle that applies to cover crops. It also could apply to crops, though it's tricky because the reason we often plant in wide rows is so we can cultivate. And maybe no matter what you did, you're going to have some weeds that escape, and then you've got these narrow rows, and it's harder to cultivate. But I think particularly for cover crops, this is useful. Well, this is from a survey that one of my students did of organic farmers in Michigan and what tools they were using for cultivation. And this is the percentage of farmers who had these tools. So flex-tine weeder, 8%, rotary hoe, 8%. Row crop cultivator was the major thing. And then some people were using rototillers. I really like the flex-tine weeders. This is, I don't know if you guys are familiar with these, but it's little spring tines that are vertical, and they kind of wiggle through the soil. And they're really designed to get weeds at white thread stage or smaller. And you can blind cultivate, so you're just, they tend not to do too much damage to the crop. So even a cucurbit crop that's got a few leaves, you can run right over the top and take out those little weeds. But once the weeds get a little more size to them, it doesn't do that much. But I think this is a really useful tool, and you can buy them kind of independently. And you can also, if you guys heard of the Williams toolbar, this is a toolbar that's sold to a lot of organic growers that has, as part of it, these tines, which can be lifted up so you can avoid your crop if you want it to, and it also has attachments for sweeps and other things. So it's kind of a multi-purpose toolbar. So I think that's a good one. We've used that. This is one, particularly for cucurbits, that is popular among some of the larger organic winter squash growers. So in western Michigan, I don't think we have any folks in this category here today, but there are people growing, processing squash, 400 plus acres. What I've seen springing up out there is this it's a Reggie weeder or eco weeder. It's not that great a picture of it, but it's a PTO driven, it's like egg beaters. And the tines are vertical and they're spinning. And there's a person, again, I got a better picture somewhere, but there's a person sitting on the back and avoiding the squash by going in and out. And they can get quite close, and it's kind of a pretty efficient way to get a lot of acreage done. And it's adaptable to other crops. There's actually one at our MSU student organic farm, and they use it for cucurbits. They also use it for all their brassica transplants. And so it can save a lot of hoeing. We've been doing a lot of work lately with these finger weeders, and we haven't worked too much with them in squash. We did do some work with some Amish organic farmers who ran this off of horse-drawn. It was kind of entertaining. And they did it through really small winter squash that was just coming up, and the weeds were small, and it was doing a pretty impressive job of taking out small weeds at a very early stage in cucurbits. We've found, as I mentioned, that it's pretty good when there's residue, so we're using it in the strip till situation. It's got these rubber tips that are flexible, so it doesn't do that much damage to the crop. It has a little give to it, so if you've got a little topography and you didn't prepare your bed quite right, it's fairly forgiving. They're still expensive, though there's some manufacturers who are currently, there's a guy in Ohio I'm talking to who's trying to make some more affordable versions of this. So I think it's something to consider. Those are, I think, the two that, in terms of cucurbits, I think are interesting and worth thinking about. This is the one we're doing a lot of research with. There's a bunch of other in-row tools. So weeding between rows is fairly straightforward. So we're not focusing our research on that because you can use sweeps and you can be aggressive. It's getting close to the crop that we're really targeting our research. How can we reduce the amount of time we're out there with a hoe? And so some of these tools that get really close to the crop, finger weeders, eco weeders. There's also something called a torsion weeder, which is kind of flexible tines that run through the soil, and it just kind of beads up the soil. So again, you're getting small weeds. Is another one that we've played with that I wouldn't recommend at this point, because if you screw up a little bit, you start taking your crop out.